I want you to picture something for a second. You are sitting in a movie theater.
Okay.
Maybe it is a rainy Sunday afternoon or late at night. And you are watching an old black and white classic from the late 40s.
It's in the scene.
Right. So the music swells, the screen fades to black, and the credits start to roll.
Which is the part where most people, walk out to get more popcorn or beat the traffic.
Exactly. But you stay. You watch the names scroll by, the director, the producer, key grip. But then you get to the writer. And let us say you are a film historian, or maybe just a really obsessive fan who has read all the books, and you realize something is wrong.
Wrong how? Like a typo?
No, more like the name on the screen. It doesn't actually exist. There is no such person. Or even creepier, maybe there is just a blank gap right where a name should be. It is literally like a ghost wrote the movie.
That is a very specific, almost haunting kind of horror story. I mean, we are so accustomed to the idea of authorship, right? If you build a table, you sign the bottom. If you paint a canvas, you sign the corner. It is a fundamental human desire to claim your work. But in mid-20th century America, we had this systematic machine designed to strip names off their creations.
And today, we are going on a deep dive into one of those ghosts. We are talking about a man named Edward Huebsch. Sometimes he is credited as Eddie, sometimes Ed, and for a really long stretch of history, absolutely nobody.
Edward Huebsch is such a fascinating entry point into this era, because usually when we hear about the Hollywood Blacklist, we get the very standard saint versus sinner narrative.
Right, the poor innocent writer getting crushed by the evil government machinery.
Exactly. And to be fair, the government was pretty crushing in this story.
Oh, absolutely. The crushing weight of the state is undeniable here. But Huebsch, he complicates that narrative.
He really does.
If you look at the sources we have pulled for this deep dive, we've got Wikipedia excerpts, we've got actual HUAC testimonies, intelligence reports, and memoirs from guys like Bernard Gordon and Victor Navasky. And through all of this, you see that Huebsch isn't just a victim, he is a combatant.
And just to jump in real quick before we get too deep into the weeds here.
Yeah, go ahead.
Because we are dealing with some very intense, highly charged political documents from the time stuff, from both the far left and the far right. We just want to make it super clear to you listening that we're not taking sides here.
Right. Good point.
We are not endorsing any of the viewpoints found in these sources, whether it's the Communist Party line or the Congressional Committee's stance. We are purely here to impartially unpack the ideas and the history contained in the original material.
Exactly. Our mission today is to figure out what happens when a complex human being gets caught in the vice. Because he was a guy who viewed film as high art, a guy who volunteered to fight in World War II, but also a guy who was a really rigid, sometimes brutal enforcer for the Communist Party.
Two massive gears grind against each other. The U.S. Congress on one side and strict party discipline on the other.
And the core question we want you to think about today is, what happens to a person when those two gears start turning? What happens to their art and what happens to their soul?
It is a heavy question.
It is. So let us unpack this. We have a huge stack of documents to go through. The transcripts from his government hearing alone are wild. Plus, we have reviews of his literary work and memories from his friends and his enemies.
Though in this particular story, the line between friend and enemy gets blurry very fast.
So let us rewind. Before the subpoenas, before the federal stakeouts, who is this guy? Because just looking at his early bio, he does not strike me as a revolutionary bomb thrower.
No, not at all. Edward Huebsch was born in New York City, February 20th, 1914. So this is a generation that comes of age right as the whole world is essentially falling apart.
World War I starts right after he is born. The Great Depression hits right when he is a teenager.
Exactly. But he has a very specific intellectual background. The sources mention a relative of his, B.W. Huebsch, who was a massive deal at Viking Press.
I mean, that is huge. That is John Steinbeck. That is Arthur Miller. That is the absolute peak of the literary establishment.
Right. So Edward isn't growing up in a vacuum. He's growing up in an environment where words have serious weight, where literature is considered serious business with a capital S and a capital B. He joins the League of American Writers early on. He's really positioning himself as an intellectual from the jump.
But then history intervenes. December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor. Huebsch is what, 27, 28?
He is in his late 20s.
Yeah.
And this is a key character moment that we absolutely cannot gloss over.
Yeah.
He does not wait around for a draft notice.
Right.
He volunteers. In 1942, immediately following the attack, he signs up for the U.S. Army.
Which is incredibly important context for later. because 10 years down the line, the government is going to paint him as this dangerous, un-American subversive. But here he is, voluntarily signing on the dotted line to go fight fascism overseas.
He does his service, the war ends, and like a lot of creative types, in 1946, he looks at New York, looks at the snow, and basically says, I'm going to California.
The gold rush of the 1940s. The movies.
He lands in Los Angeles in 46. The post-war economy is booming. The studios are just churning out content. And Huebsch starts getting work. But, and this is a crucial distinction made by historians, Supplair in England, Huebsch wasn't just a hack.
Because we tend to think of 40s screenwriters as these sort of assembly line workers, right? Like, give me a cowboy movie by Friday.
The factory system, yes. And Huebsch did do some of that genre work. He wrote horror, he wrote thrillers, things like The Son of Dr. Jekyll and The Wreck of the Hesperus. But Supplair in England specifically group him with the writers who treated film as high art.
High art. Which, honestly, sounds a bit pretentious for a guy writing The Son of Dr. Jekyll.
It does sound a bit lofty.
Let's see.
But you have to look at his other credits. In 1948, he adapts a Mark Twain story called Best Man Wins. Adapting Mark Twain is not something a studio hands to the guy who just writes cheap pratfalls.
No, you need someone who understands voice, satire, social commentary.
Exactly. Huebsch wanted cinema to be literature. He saw the potential for the medium to be so much more than just disposable weekend entertainment. He brought that Viking press pedigree to Hollywood.
So he's ambitious, he is clearly talented, he is a veteran. By all accounts, he should be on the fast track to a long, lucrative career. But while he is climbing the studio ladder, he's also getting really deep into the local politics.
And this is where we have to adjust our mental picture of what communist recruitment actually looked like back then. Because I think when we hear those words today, we imagine a dark alley, a guy in a trench coat passing a microfilm, whispering about overthrowing the government.
Right, spy stuff, secret codes, espionage.
But in Hollywood in the late 40s, it was boring, it was deeply bureaucratic, it was mostly just labor politics.
We have this really revealing testimony from Stanley Roberts, who was another screenwriter in the industry. And in May of 1952, he is sitting in front of the committee, HUAC, and he is spilling the beans on how he got recruited into the party. And Huebsch is the absolute star of this story.
Roberts describes being visited by what he calls delegates. It sounds more like a church committee or a neighborhood watch meeting.
Listen to the pitch Roberts describes in his testimony. He says they didn't talk about Stalin. They didn't talk about the proletariat rising up in violent revolution. What were they actually selling?
They were selling better conditions in the Screenwriters Guild. They were selling higher wages. They were talking about furthering Roosevelt's policies.
That is it. That is the grand communist pitch. Hey, do you like FDR and making more money?
It was an incredibly soft sell. Roberts even told the committee that, in his view, communism in Hollywood didn't seem to go anywhere beyond that. It was hyper-local. It was entirely focused on the union and labor issues.
But Huebsch was the guy making that pitch. Roberts specifically names him as a delegate. And what strikes me from the source material is how relentlessly persistent Huebsch was. Because Roberts actually quits the party in 1946. He gets bored or maybe disillusioned and he walks away. But Huebsch comes back.
He knocks on his door again.
Why? To start a revolution?
No. To support the CSU strike, the Conference of Studio Unions.
Okay, we need to pause on the CSU strike for a second, because if we don't understand this, we don't understand why the heat was turned up so high. This wasn't just a bunch of writers holding signs and singing songs outside a gate. This was what became known as Hollywood Black Friday.
This is critical context. In October 1945, at the Warner Brothers studio, this strike turned into an all-out riot. We're talking about studio firefighters turning high-pressure hoses on screenwriters and set decorators. We're talking about tear gas canisters flying through the air, chains, overturned cars, and bloody noses.
So when we say Huebsch was recruiting for the strike, he wasn't asking people to sign a politely worded petition. He was asking them to join a literal street fight against the studio moguls.
Seriously. And for men like Huebsch, this was the front line. He wasn't just sitting in a cafe theorizing. He was actively organizing support for a massive, violent labor conflict. And in the eyes of the studios and eventually the FBI, that is what made him dangerous. Not because he was a spy handing nuclear secrets to the Soviets, but because he was highly effective at shutting down the production lines in Hollywood.
So he is a true believer. He is knocking on doors. He is getting people to the picket lines. But by 1951, the climate has drastically shifted. The Cold War is freezing over. The FBI isn't just watching anymore. They are acting.
And this brings us to the real thriller part of the deep dive.
Yeah?
The chase.
It is April 1951. Enter William A. Wheeler. He is an investigator for HUAC. And he has a piece of paper in his pocket with Edward Huebsch's name on it, the subpoena.
Now, getting subpoenaed today usually means you get a registered letter in the mail or someone in a suit hands you an envelope at your office. But in 1951 Hollywood, it was a high-stakes game of cat and mouse. Because if they cannot serve you the paper, you do not have to testify. And if you don't testify, you cannot be forced to name names.
So Wheeler testifies that they got the subpoena late. They rush over to Huebsch's house in the valley. 11200 Lamida. It is nighttime. They pound on the door, and Mrs. Huebsch answers.
And according to the testimony, she is cool as a cucumber. She looks at these federal agents and says, "Oh, my husband isn't home right now, but he will be back later tonight."
The absolute oldest trick in the book.
But the U.S. Marshals buy it, or at least they have no choice but to wait. So they set up a stakeout. Picture this. A dark suburban street, unmarked cars, men in fedoras, chain-smoking cigarettes, just watching the front door of a screenwriter's house.
They sit there for hours, all through the night. No Eddie.
And then the sun comes up, and the neighbors witness something that tells you everything you need to know about the sheer panic of that historical moment. Mrs. Huebsch comes out, calmly loads up the family station wagon, and just drives away.
Just like that.
Just like that. Wheeler says in his report, no one has been there for the last 5 weeks. He completely vanished. They abandoned their own house.
Imagine the stress of that reality. You are a writer, you adapt Mark Twain, you spend your days worrying about dialogue and character arcs, and suddenly you were throwing suitcases into a station wagon and fleeing your own life because the federal government wants to ask you questions you cannot answer without destroying your friends' lives.
He became a fugitive writer. But the massive problem with running is that the hearings go on without you, and people were starting to talk.
This is the naming names phase, and it is brutal to read through.
It is a cascade of betrayal. Frank Tuttle, a director, is on the stand. He is rattling off names of suspected subversives to the committee. And he gets to Huebsch. He says Huebsch, Huebsch. I think it was Eddie.
I think it was Eddie. That hesitation just kills me. You are actively destroying a man's career. You are putting him on a federal blacklist, and you aren't even 100% sure of his first name.
That speaks volumes about the chaotic, almost haphazard nature of the witch hunt. It was all about quantity over quality. Just give us names. Then David A. Lang comes in later, in 1953. He is much more specific. He places Huebsch in a communist cell. He lists him right alongside other major writers like Hugo Butler and Dalton Trumbo. But Lang mentions something really interesting. He says Huebsch was part of a writer's clinic.
A writer's clinic? That sounds entirely innocent, like a weekend workshop where you critique each other's dialogue over coffee. Hey, Eddie, Act 2 is a little slow, maybe tighten up the pacing.
If only it were that benign.
In the specific context of the party structure, a clinic was often about ideological purity. It was a mechanism for control.
Control how? Like editing the scripts? Yes. But they would review scripts not for artistic merit, but for political correctness. Does this character represent the working class correctly? Is the capitalist villain sufficiently evil? So Lang isn't just saying Huebsch was a casual member. He is saying Huebsch was essentially part of the thought police. He was part of the machinery that tried to insert or remove messages in films to serve the party's broader goals.
So the committee is painting Huebsch as a ringleader, a guy enforcing the doctrine. Meanwhile, he is still technically on the run. He is successfully ducking that subpoena. And this leads us to, honestly, what I think is the most heartbreaking story in this entire deep dive, the guild meeting incident.
This account comes directly from Bernard Gordon's memoir, Hollywood Exile, and it captures the suffocating atmosphere of fear better than any official government transcript ever could.
Set the scene for us. It is a meeting of the Screenwriters Guild, the union that is literally supposed to protect these guys.
Right. Now, keep in mind, Huebsch is still hiding. He's actively avoiding the marshals.
Yeah.
But the guild is holding a massive meeting to discuss the blacklist itself. This is his life. This is his entire career on the line. He decides he absolutely has to be there.
It is a huge calculated risk. He goes to the meeting hall. But as he approaches the building, who does he see lurking outside?
The federal marshal. The guy with the subpoena in his pocket. He is waiting right by the door, scanning faces as people walk in.
So Huebsch has to think fast. He realizes, wait, the marshal is not a member of the union. He cannot legally come inside. So Huebsch slips in. Maybe he goes through a back door or just pushes past in the crowd. And once he is safely inside, he takes the floor.
He stands up in front of his colleagues, his friends, his co-writers,
and
he makes a procedural motion. He asks the chair to bar the marshal from entering the hall. He essentially says, This is a closed meeting, members only. Keep that guy out so we can conduct our business.
It is a really smart play. He is using the union's own bylaws to buy himself sanctuary. And he probably thinks the room is with him. These are his union brothers and sisters.
But then the room turns. A member from the right-wing faction of the guild stands up. He raises a point of order.
And reading this, I almost could not believe it actually happened. What does this guy propose?
He moves up that the marshal be given temporary membership in the Screenwriters Guild, specifically so he can enter the hall and serve the subpoena on Huebsch.
They voted to make the hunter a member of the club just so he could catch the prey.
And they put it to a vote, all those writers in the room. And they voted in favor of the motion.
Wow. Just wow.
Imagine standing there at the podium. You are looking out at people you've had lunch with, people you have broken story with, people whose kids play with your kids. And you watch them raise their hands to say, yes, let the police in to get him.
Why would they do that? Was Huebsch that hated personally? Or was it something else?
Bernard Gordon wrote that this specific moment was the ultimate proof of how deep the fear went. He said, and I am paraphrasing here, that no one dared to oppose the extreme right wing openly. It wasn't that everyone in that room hated Huebsch, is that they were completely terrified. If you voted no, if you tried to protect him, were you going to be next? Would they mark your name down as a sympathizer?
It is the total collapse of solidarity. The mentality becomes, we will sell you out to save ourselves.
So the motion passes. The doors open. The marshal walks in, walks right up to Huebsch in the middle of this crowded room and hands him the paper.
Gotcha. The chase is finally over. Huebsch has been served. He has to go to Washington and face the music.
And face it, he does.
Yeah.
March 1953. Edward Huebsch walks into the hearing room. And if the committee expected him to be cowed or to plead for mercy, they were in for a massive shock.
Reading this testimony, it feels electric. Most people know the Hollywood 10 approach, which was a lot of shouting, making speeches, getting physically dragged out of the room, or the standard Fifth Amendment approach, where you just stay quiet and read a statement. Huebsch does something completely different. He decides to act like an incredibly aggressive lawyer.
A very aggressive, very sarcastic lawyer.
First thing he does, he objects to the TV cameras.
That is right. He flat out refuses to testify if he is being filmed. He essentially tells them, I am not going to be a prop in your television show. And amazingly, the committee blinks. They actually agreed to reschedule him.
So he comes back a couple of days later, March 25th. No cameras. They assure him he isn't being recorded for broadcast, though obviously the stenographer transcript survives. And he starts right out of the gate by going after the chairman of the committee, Harold Velde.
He repeatedly addresses him as King Harold Velde.
King Harold, I mean, that is just gutsy when these guys hold your entire future in their hands.
It is a very specific intellectual historical chap. He's referencing King George III. He is actively framing the Congressional Committee not as a democratic body, but as a tyranny. He is saying, you are acting exactly like the monarchy we fought a revolution to get rid of. He is completely flipping the script on them. He is calling them the un-American ones.
And the committee tries to put him in the standard trap. They ask, are you a member of the Communist Party? Answer, yes or no.
This was the ultimate trap. Because if you say no, and they have a witness like David Lang who already said yes, you go straight to federal prison for perjury. If you say yes, you have legally waived your right to silence, and they can force you to name names or hold you in contempt.
But Huebsch doesn't just plead the Fifth and leave it at that. He actually sits there and lectures them on the Constitution.
He uses what we might call the gambit of amendments. When they try to force the yes or no, he cites the Fifth Amendment clause prohibiting such coercion. But he doesn't stop there. He refuses to answer based on the First Amendment, freedom of speech and association, the Fifth Amendment, the privilege against self-incrimination, but then throws in the Ninth and Tenth Amendments.
Okay, I think most of you listening know the First and the Fifth. You hear about those all the time. But the Ninth and Tenth, those are deep cuts. What was his legal theory there?
It is brilliant, really, and quite novel for the time period. The Ninth Amendment basically says, just because the Constitution lists certain specific rights, that does not mean that people don't have other rights that aren't explicitly listed. It is like the et cetera clause of the Bill of Rights. And the 10th Amendment says that any power not specifically given to the federal government belongs to the states or to the people.
So he is arguing jurisdiction. He is telling them they are out of bounds.
Exactly. He is arguing that the federal government has absolutely no constitutional power to ask him what he thinks, what he reads, or who he hangs out with. He is saying, It isn't just that I don't want to answer you. It is that you have no legal right to even ask the question in the first place.
The New York Times actually covered this hearing. They described it as verbal jousting. They noted that the committee members were absolutely furious with him. They officially called him contemptuous.
And he was. He had total undisguised contempt for them. He wasn't playing the victim at all. He was playing the prosecutor. He was essentially putting the United States Congress on trial.
So if we stop the movie right here, Edward Huebsch looks like a pure hero of civil liberties. He is the guy standing up to King Harold, citing the Ninth Amendment, fighting for the very soul of America against a committee of bullies.
But history is never that clean. And this is exactly why we do these deep dives. Because while Huebsch was an absolute tiger in that hearing room defending his own constitutional rights, he was also a strict disciplinarian for the party, who didn't seem to care very much about the rights of others within his own circle.
We have to talk about the high noon incident.
This is the pivotal counterweight to his heroic testimony. This comes from Victor Navasky's book, Naming Names, and it involves a very famous figure, Carl Foreman.
Carl Foreman, the writer of High Noon, which is the ultimate movie about a guy standing all alone while his entire community abandons him to face the bad guys. Which, ironically, sounds exactly like what happened to Huebsch at that guild meeting.
The irony is incredibly thick. You could cut it with a knife. But in this particular story, Huebsch isn't Gary Cooper standing alone. He is the bad guy. Or at the very least, he is the heavy, the enforcer.
So what is the setup for this meeting?
The party leadership is extremely worried about Carl Foreman. They know he is under immense pressure from the studios and the government. They think he is going to break. They think he is going to name names just to save his career and his movie. So they send Eddie Huebsch to talk to him.
And Huebsch later described this himself. He said, "I was assigned by the party to find out what Foreman's testimony was going to be. Assigned, he treats it like a military mission."
They meet for lunch at a place called Lucy's.
Lucy's. The fanciest restaurant in Hollywood at the time, right across the street from Paramount Studios, a place where you explicitly go to be seen by the industry.
And how long does this lunch last?
Huebsch says in the sources, "I sat for 11 hours with him."
11 hours. That isn't a lunch. That is an interrogation with a waiter occasionally refilling the water glasses.
Just imagine the intense psychological pressure of that. 11 straight hours of Huebsch drilling Foreman across the table. What are you going to say? Are you going to sell us out? Where exactly do you stand?
You really have to understand Huebsch's personality here. He is relentless. Remember, he is the guy who went back to recruit Stanley Roberts months after Roberts had already quit. He does not give up. He is sitting there at Lucy's, probably smoking pack after pack of cigarettes, just wearing Carl Foreman down.
And what was the verdict? Did he break him?
Not quite. Huebsch could not get Foreman to commit to the rigid party line, which would be to refuse to cooperate entirely, like Huebsch did. But he also couldn't get him to admit he was going to name names. Foreman was trying to find a nuanced middle ground. He wanted to testify about his own past, but refused to talk about others.
And Huebsch absolutely hated that.
He despised it. Huebsch's retrospective assessment of that meeting is brutal. He said, and this is a direct quote, the main point is, Carl wouldn't tell the commies to go fuck themselves.
So, wait. Unpack that for us. Huebsch, who is the dedicated communist in this scenario, is angry that Foreman wouldn't tell the communists to get lost.
It is a kind of ideological doublespeak. Huebsch felt that Foreman was being slippery and evasive. Huebsch respected strength and conviction above all else. If Foreman was a real man in Huebsch's eyes, he would either be a fiercely dedicated communist or a fiercely dedicated anti-communist. Pick a side and fight. But this middle-of-the-road, compromise stuff, Huebsch viewed it as pure weakness. He went back and reported Foreman as an informer to the party leadership.
He actually recommended expulsion. He wanted Foreman kicked out of the party before he could even testify.
So look at the complete picture we have now. On a Tuesday, Huebsch is in Washington, D.C., fighting passionately for his right to free speech and association, citing the Ninth Amendment. On a Wednesday, he is back in Hollywood sitting in a restaurant for 11 hours trying to force a fellow writer to conform to a rigid political line or face expulsion and ruin.
It seems wildly hypocritical.
It is hypocritical. But it also perfectly illustrates the intense rigidity of the era. You had to choose a side, and once you chose, you had to follow the orders of that side. Huebsch was a man of deep principle, but his principles led him to be persecuted by the state and to act as a persecutor for the party. He fully believed that the ends justified the means.
It really is tragic. He is caught in the machinery. And eventually the machinery wins, because after 1953, The Hollywood career is over.
The erasure begins.
We see it in the actual credits. The son of Dr. Jekyll, his name is just gone. Snipped right out of the reel.
And he enters what historians call the shadow years. This is the period where these blacklisted writers could not work under their own names. They had to find fronts, people who would pretend to write the scripts and take the checks, or they had to use pseudonyms.
Huebsch becomes Eduardo Bueno.
Good Edward.
It is a playful but also slightly sad nod to his own identity. He writes a movie called Little Giants in 1958. The credits say, screenplay by Eduardo Bueno. He also worked with Hugo Butler on that, who was using the name Hugo Mozo. Huebsch is literally ghostwriting his own life.
And this goes on for 20 years. 20 years of forced silence. Imagine being at the absolute peak of your powers, talented enough to adapt Mark Twain, and for 2 full decades you were essentially invisible to the public.
It is not until the late 70s that he tries to make a real credited public comeback. And the project he picks, man, it fits his life story perfectly.
1977. Twilight's Last Gleaming.
Yeah.
Directed by Robert Aldrich.
Have you seen this movie? It is incredibly intense. Burt Lancaster plays this disillusioned Air Force general who takes over a nuclear missile silo and threatens to start World War III unless the president reveals the secret truths to the public about the Vietnam War.
It is the ultimate post-Watergate, post-Vietnam paranoia thriller. It is a movie entirely about a man who served his country, got profoundly betrayed by the government apparatus, and decides to hold a gun to the head of the establishment to force them to be honest.
It is autobiography wrapped in Hollywood thriller. Huebsch is the general. He is the guy saying, tell the truth or I blow the whole thing up.
He was channeling all that stored-up rage, all that betrayal from the Screenwriters Guild meeting, all that contempt for King Harold Velde. He poured all of it into this script.
The reviews were really fascinating. Variety loved it. They called it intricate, intriguing, and intelligent. But the New York Times, they absolutely hated it. They called it deadly, solemn, gadgety suspense melodrama.
Ouch. But, you know, looking back, a review from 2012 called it a quintessentially 70s moment. It seems Huebsch was really tapping into the cultural zeitgeist, that deep feeling of mistrust in institutions, even if all the critics weren't quite ready for it at the time.
But the big comeback didn't fully take. He tried to pivot to novels next. In 1979, he published a book called The Last Summer of Mata Hari, historical fiction.
And this kind of proves that screenwriting and novel writing are 2 entirely different sports.
Very different creative muscles.
Right, because in a screenplay, you are essentially writing blueprints.
Mm-hmm.
You rely on the director, the lighting team, and the actors to bring the emotion and the subtext to life. In a novel, you have to do all of that heavy lifting yourself with just the prose.
The Kirkus review for this book was absolutely savage. I have to read this quote because it is rare to see a review this mean. They wrote, "Noble banalities pulse endlessly from Mata's tear-drenched heartstrings. Pathos supreme."
Pathos supreme. That is a career-ending phrase right there.
It really suggests that while he could perfectly structure a thriller script, the prose style just got away from him. Maybe he was trying too hard to be literary again, trying to recapture that Viking Press high art label he had back in 1946.
It is a really sad note to end on professionally. He spends decades in the shadows, finally tries to come back, gets mixed reviews on his big film, gets slammed on his novel, and then in 1982, he dies. He was 68 years old.
He never got to see his name fully restored while he was alive.
No, he didn't. The real outro to this story, the restorative justice part, happens much later, in 1997 and 2000. That is when the Writers Guild of America West finally, officially corrected the historical credits. They scrubbed Eduardo Bueno from the records and put Edward Huebsch back on the screen for films like Little Giants.
It took 50 years. But they finally fixed the glitch.
It matters. It really matters that we go back and fill in those blanks. Because Edward Huebsch represents the deep complexity of that time. He wasn't a saint. He was a guy who would sit you down for 11 hours and grill you until you broke. But he was also a guy who stood face-to-face with the United States government and said, you have no constitutional right to ask me these questions.
He leaves us with a lot to chew on, especially regarding the concept of loyalty. You know, I keep thinking back to that guild meeting.
The vote
to let the marshal in. It is so easy for us, sitting here with our microphones in 2026, to say, oh, I would have voted no. I would have stood on my chair and shouted shame.
It is always very easy to be brave in hindsight.
But if you were actually in that room, if you had a mortgage to pay, if you had kids at home, if you knew for a fact that the FBI was taking down license plate numbers in the parking lot, and you see everyone else's hand go up.
That is the ultimate question.
Hmm.
Solidarity is a beautiful concept when you read about it in a textbook. It is a terrifying thing to actually practice when the subpoena is standing right there in the room.
Edward Huebsch walked out of that room with the subpoena, and he never really walked back into the life he had built. But he left us a story that is absolutely worth diving into.
A story about the deliberate erasure of a name and the very long, very slow road to getting it back.
That is a perfect place to leave it. Think about that vote. Think about what you would have done. That is it for this deep dive. Thanks for listening.
Thanks for joining us.